My name is Elena Vargas. I am 42 years old and serve as a magistrate on the Superior Court specialized in corporate and financial law. To my family, especially my uncle-in-law Edward Thompson, I am simply the secretary who works at the courthouse and never achieved anything important in life. What he does not know is that for the past 5 years I have presided over some of the most complex corporate cases in the country, including several that directly involve his companies. The misunderstanding began 8 years ago when my cousin Sophia married Edward, a successful businessman who owns a chain of restaurants and several commercial properties. During the wedding, when I was introduced as Elena who works in the judicial branch, Edward immediately assumed I was a secretary or administrative assistant. "Ah, how nice," he had commented with condescension. "It is important for women to have stable jobs, even if they are not very ambitious." I never bothered to correct him. At that time I was already a trial judge and had just completed my master's degree in corporate law. My work required absolute discretion, and I had learned that keeping a low profile at social gatherings was not only prudent but necessary. The misunderstanding solidified during subsequent family gatherings. Edward would always ask about my office work and make comments about how comfortable it must be to have a government job with few responsibilities. "Your work must be very routine," he would say while describing his business problems. "It must be relaxing not to worry about billing or clients." The irony was that while he spoke of his complex commercial challenges, I had been reviewing cases involving corporate disputes 1,000 times more complicated than managing a restaurant chain. But I maintained my professional silence. My real work was fascinating and demanding. As a specialized magistrate, I handled cases of corporate mergers, international commercial disputes, and financial fraud investigations. My decisions affected thousands of jobs and millions in commercial transactions. I had issued rulings in cases that established important legal precedents and had been invited to international conferences on corporate law. But for Edward, I remained the cousin who never got ahead. The situation worsened when I was promoted to magistrate 3 years ago. My appointment appeared in all the national newspapers, but Edward never reads the legal sections. For him, important news was only about business and sports. "Are you still in the same job?" he would ask every Christmas. "You should consider finding something better. At your age you should already be professionally established." His comments became especially hurtful during family gatherings, where he never missed an opportunity to compare my lack of ambition with the achievements of other relatives. "Look at my nephew Carlos," he would say, pointing to a cousin who had opened a consultancy. "He understood that to succeed you have to be an entrepreneur, not settle for an office worker's salary." What Edward did not know was that I earned more in 1 year than he billed in his most successful business. But my professional discretion prevented me from boasting about my position or my income. The family attention reached its peak during this year's Christmas dinner, held at Edward's new house in the upscale neighborhood. He had invited several business partners and lawyers to mix the family celebration with business opportunities. "Elena, sit over there," he indicated, pointing to a table far from the main dining area. "This table is for business discussions. You would be more comfortable with the wives and children." My cousin Sophia looked at me with pity but said nothing. She had learned not to contradict Edward in public. I headed to the assigned table without protest, sitting next to the wives of his partners and some younger relatives. From my place I could clearly hear the business conversation that Edward considered so sophisticated. "The problem with the new corporate regulations," he said pompously while cutting his meat, "is that government bureaucrats do not understand how the real world of business works." His guests nodded reverently, although their comments revealed a rather superficial understanding of the corporate laws he criticized. "These new rules on financial transparency are ridiculous," he continued. "They only complicate processes for honest businessmen like us." Internally I smiled. Those new rules had been the direct result of a series of judicial decisions that I had written after reviewing cases of corporate fraud. The regulations he criticized existed precisely to prevent the questionable practices that some businessmen considered normal. "Right, Elena," he shouted from his table, including me in the conversation in a condescending way. "You who work in government surely see all the useless paperwork these regulations generate." All eyes turned toward me. Edward clearly expected me to confirm his perspective from my position as a low-level government employee. "Regulations usually have specific reasons," I responded diplomatically. "That is why I prefer to work with real lawyers," Edward continued, addressing his guests, "not with bureaucrats who only see forms and procedures." He made a theatrical pause, clearly enjoying his role as a successful businessman educating the family. "Secretaries do not understand corporate law. It is a world too complex for those who have not been in the trenches of real business. The comment felt like a slap. Not only had he minimized my profession, but he had used his ignorance about my real work to humiliate me in front of the entire family and his partners. Of course not, I nodded calmly, keeping my voice controlled and professional. Edward smiled satisfied, interpreting my response as confirmation of his superiority. His partners nodded with an air of understanding, as if they had just heard great business wisdom. Exactly, he continued, now addressing his business guests completely. That is why it is crucial to surround yourself with professionals who truly understand modern corporate law. We cannot allow secretaries and assistants to opine on topics that require true expertise. The conversation continued along these lines for several more minutes, with Edward pontificating about the complexity of commercial laws and the importance of having top-level legal advisors. At that moment, the doorbell rang repeatedly. Edward frowned, annoyed by the interruption in the middle of his speech on legal sophistication. "Are we expecting someone else?" Sophia asked as she headed to the door. "My lawyers," Edward replied, checking his watch. "I told him to come after 9 to review some urgent contracts. They always work, even on Christmas. That is real professional dedication." Moments later, Sophia returned accompanied by 3 men in formal suits. I immediately recognized Attorney Morales and Attorney Herrera, 2 of the most recognized corporate lawyers in the city. The third was younger, probably a senior associate. "Sorry for the delay, Mr. Thompson," said Attorney Morales as he approached the main table. "The Christmas traffic complicated our." His words cut off abruptly when he saw me. His eyes widened with surprise and an expression that mixed recognition with absolute panic. "Magistrate Vargas," he stammered, his voice losing all its professional confidence. "We did not expect to see you here." The silence that followed was deafening. All conversations stopped instantly. Edward looked confused between his lawyers and me. "Magistrate," he murmured, clearly bewildered. Attorney Herrera approached immediately, his face pale as he processed the implications of the situation. "Madam Magistrate, I want to clarify that we did not know of your presence here. If there is any conflict of interest with the pending cases—" "Do not worry," I interrupted softly, rising from my chair. "This is a family gathering." Edward stood up slowly, his face showing total confusion as he alternated his gaze between his lawyers and me. "Can someone explain to me what is going on?" Attorney Morales cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Thompson, did we not tell you that the merger case with Valley Restaurants is being reviewed by Magistrate Vargas?" "Magistrate Vargas," Edward repeated mechanically. His relative," stammered the younger lawyer, pointing at me with a trembling hand. "But she is a secretary," Edward protested weakly. The 3 lawyers exchanged looks of disbelief. Attorney Herrera was the first to find his voice. "Mr. Thompson, Magistrate Vargas is one of the most respected jurists in corporate law in the country. She presides over the Superior Court specialized in complex commercial cases." Edward sat down heavily in his chair, the color completely draining from his face. "Impossible. In fact," continued Attorney Morales, clearly uncomfortable, "we just received her latest decision on the Santander corporate case. Her analysis of the financial transparency regulations was brilliant." I walked calmly toward the main table, feeling all eyes on me. "Those ridiculous regulations you were talking about a few minutes ago," I said, addressing Edward, "were designed based on legal precedents that we established after reviewing hundreds of cases of corporate fraud." Attorney Herrera nodded vigorously. "Magistrate Vargas wrote the rulings that created the modern legal framework for business transparency. Her work has been cited by international courts." Edward opened and closed his mouth several times without making a sound. But you said you worked in government." "I work for the judicial branch," I clarified. "I am a magistrate of the Superior Court of Justice, specialized in corporate and financial law. And one of the most outstanding," added Attorney Morales. "Her decisions have established precedents that affect the entire Mexican commercial jurisprudence." Edward's business partners began to whisper among themselves, clearly re-evaluating everything they had heard during dinner. "How long have you been?" Edward began to ask. 12 years as a judge. 5 as a magistrate," I responded, "but I have always worked in corporate law." Attorney Herrera addressed me directly. "Magistrate, we want to apologize for anything we may have said that could have been interpreted as—" "Do not worry," I reassured them. "I understand you were in a social gathering." Edward finally found his voice, although it sounded small and broken. "Elena, I did not know. If you had told me, would you have changed your attitude?" I asked directly. "Or would you simply have been more careful with your words?" He did not respond, but his silence was answer enough. By the way, I added, addressing the lawyers about the Valley Restaurants case they mentioned. The hearing is scheduled for January 15th. The three lawyers exchanged nervous glances. Clearly there were aspects of the case they preferred not to discuss in front of Edward. Is there any problem with the case? Edward asked, his voice revealing growing anxiety. Well, Attorney Morales hesitated. There are some irregularities in the financial documentation we presented. We hope to resolve them before the hearing. I headed toward the exit, but before leaving I turned back to Edward. Those trenches of real business you were talking about are exactly the type of experience we review in court every day. I paused, looking around the table of guests and at the secretaries who do not understand corporate law. Many of them have more legal knowledge than some businessmen who think the rules do not apply to them. The following weeks were particularly interesting. Edward called me repeatedly, alternating between desperate apologies and subtle attempts to influence pending cases. Elena, I wanted to apologize for my ignorance, he said during one of his calls. I had no idea about your position. The problem is not that you did not know my position, Edward. The problem is how you treated someone you believed had less power than you. We could have lunch to discuss the legal perspectives of my cases. Edward, that would be completely inappropriate. And if your lawyers suggested you contact me directly, you need new lawyers. The Valley Restaurants case was resolved in January. The irregularities mentioned by the lawyers turned out to be significant violations of financial transparency regulations. Edward received a substantial fine and was forced to completely restructure his accounting practices. During the next family gathering in February, the dynamic had changed completely. Edward treated me with exaggerated deference that was almost comical. Elena Vargas, what an honor to have you here, he said when I arrived. Would you like to sit at the head of the table? I am fine where I always sit, I responded, heading to my usual place with the wives and younger relatives. But you are a magistrate, he insisted. You should be with the professionals. Edward, respect should not depend on titles or positions. If you only respect me now because you know my rank, then you really do not respect me. His transformation was so radical that it felt uncomfortable. Where he once ignored me, he now constantly sought my approval. Where he once pontificated about laws he did not understand, he now asked me for explanations about every commercial regulation. Could you explain to me why these new rules on audits exist? He asked during dinner. The same rules you called ridiculous at Christmas, I reminded him. He blushed visibly. 6 months later, during Sophia's birthday celebration, Edward apologized publicly. I want to ask Elena Vargas for forgiveness in front of the whole family, he announced during the toast. My ignorance and my prejudices made me treat her unfairly for years. I have learned a lot about humility and respect. The apology seemed sincere, although I knew part of his motivation was the fear that I might handle more cases related to his businesses. I accept your apology, Edward, I responded, but I hope you have learned to treat all people with respect. Not only those whose power you know. A year later, the change in Edward was genuine. He no longer categorized people according to his perception of their jobs or social positions. He had developed real humility and had become a more ethical businessman. Elena Vargas, he told me during the following Christmas, I wanted to thank you for teaching me a lesson I needed to learn. What was it? That true wisdom comes from recognizing how much we do not know, especially about the people around us. Now, when he speaks of corporate regulations, he does so with real respect and understanding. He has transformed his business practices to comply not only with the letter of the law but with its spirit. And every time someone at family gatherings minimizes another person's work, Edward is the first to remind him that appearances can be deceiving. On the night of that memorable Christmas dinner, as I drove home, I reflected on the irony of the situation. For years, Edward had pontificated about corporate law in front of the person who literally wrote the rules he criticized. But more importantly, he had learned that genuine respect is not built on titles or positions. It can only come from recognizing the inherent value of each person, regardless of what we think we know about them. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. See you in the next story.